Hello and welcome to Simon Says Artwork. In this video I'm going to be talking about how to draw from imagination, and what I'm going to use is just a piece of A4 paper. And first of all I'm going to draw around a border around the outside, and within that creates a series of panels. So I think I'd like either 4 or 5 vertical strips, and I'm going to create some hatching inside of those and see what shapes and designs come out of those ideas. So okay, let's get started. Okay, so this is going to be a real-time demonstration of how I do my hatching patterns. And I'm going to start off in this process by creating a bit of a template for the page. Now, I'm not much of a measurer to make sure that things are equal, so you'll have to forgive that. That's just my way. I always just eyeball things, and I don't really care too much for measuring and putting dots and things. I just try to get an approximation, something which I'm satisfied with. That is something which is perhaps something which I should improve upon, but I quite like looking and saying that looks even to me. I'm just going to draw a line there, because if it's not even, it's going to be so I don't know, such a small percentage off that if I need to trim something, it's not going to be a big deal if I lose part of a drawing based on scanning it in, putting it onto a digital platform, and then making sure that it's all measured correctly. So for the initial page, I just do what I'm happy with, and then I do slight measurements for the boxes across the page, but that's more because as soon as you do several bars horizontally, not horizontally, I always do that vertically. I mean, I suppose it'd be either, but in this example, it's vertical, sorry. So as soon as you do several of these, you can start to see where the discrepancy is, and one will become very narrow at one side and the other won't. In fact, to be honest, even with measurements, I think that happens here, but I do my best to try to accommodate for all of the panels and to get away with what I'm trying to achieve, which is just a series of strips in order to have something which looks like an interesting page of bars, just lines that are segmenting the page. And then I want it to be different small shapes, so that the drawing which I do inside of these boxes can then relate to the others without me consciously guiding them that way. They'll all be affecting each other by the time that the page is finished. So the concept is to just make this hatching, because I do really enjoy hatching, as you all know. So that's what I'm trying to achieve, is to create a template for the page and then turn that page into something which will be, I don't know, interesting, hopefully. Now, this is the time-consuming part. It's just, I say that actually, the time-consuming part is probably doing the hatching, but for me this is the most laborious part of the process, because it's literally just holding a ruler and drawing lines and trying to make sure things are straight, and not my favourite part of the process. I quite like drawing lines that can curve and that can move around and that can make shapes by the pathway which they follow. And that's the interesting part of hatching to me. Whereas this part is just necessary evil. But I will say, once you've done this first page, if you're going to do several more, it becomes much easier, because you can base the next page on the scale of this, and I'll show you what I mean. But for this section, I'm just drawing all these vertical lines in pencil first, just to make sure that they are close enough, and then I'll put ink on the top, which is the next step that I'm going to do now. But I've got to decide what thickness of ink, because the lines and the bars for the outlines of this drawing will be something which I think will have an impact on the inside. And what I mean is that if I do it all uniform and the same, then it won't necessarily have a level of depth to it. Whereas if I do two different thicknesses of pen just for the outline, it will immediately become a little bit more interesting. So I'm picking different thicknesses for the pens. I'm going to start off by just drawing the marks in and ensuring that what I've got is going to have the ink just down, just so that I'm happy that it's got an outline. But the finished concept is basically I am actually measuring, and I think I'm fairly close here. So anyway, I think I'm just doing slight little corrective marks, measuring afterwards. After all that nonsense about not caring about measuring, you can see here that I'm obviously making a little bit of a mark just because, well, if I'm that much off, then it will affect everything. But you can correct all this afterwards in Photoshop by just getting rid of any lines which go wonky and any marks which go outside of the lines, if you want to keep it neat like I'm trying to do here. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is use one pen, one thickness of pen, to do all of the lines, just so that I'm not messing about going back and forth time and time again. But after I've done all of these lines with one type of pen, and this is I think it's a 0.1 by the looks of the nib. Once I've done all of them in this thickness, then I'm going to get a thicker nib to go back over certain parts, because you'll see what I mean. It looks much better when you change the outside lines to a thicker nib and leave the inside lines a thinner nib. That's my opinion anyway. So other people may say, oh, you shouldn't do that, but I'm not sure. I've never heard anyone say that, and I'm not sure of any reason why you would. I think it just creates a sense of depth straight away when you do things like this. And it is, a lot of the time, you're trying to create an illusion. That's part of the fun of hatching, and especially cross-hatching. But on this page, I'm not going to do any cross-hatching. It's just going to be solely focused on just lines and marks, and not crossing back over those lines and marks. Not for the start. I've had this thought where if I can develop lines and marks into patterns and styles, and showing how far certain things go just with the thickness of the nib progressively throughout different pages, then my intention is to create a kind of a coffee table book, which I really like the idea of. So it's going to be a long process, and for this first one I'm going to do it as a real-time video to show you how I approach things like this. And if you enjoy hatching and ideas like this, then I recommend you try something similar yourself. But it doesn't have to be following what I'm doing here, because this is for a specific idea that I'm trying to achieve. And if you do your own, say you do like little squares or rectangles, like a comic book page, then that will be your own idea, and it'll have your own injection of creativity into it. Now, not all of my pages are going to be vertical bars like this. I am going to do boxes inside and vary up the patterns and the difference, but for the time being it's going to be started off with just vertical panels. Now you can see from that thicker line on the outside there how much different it is, and I think that's already adding a level of interest that wasn't there beforehand. Now when you connect all of these boxes from the top and the bottom, you have this unified form of outside bars with weight and inside bars with a lighter stroke. And that's what I really like and I'm trying to achieve. Can you see it on the top bars? It's just interesting to me, just the difference between those lines and how it holds it all together. It's a strange type of almost a fiction that you're trying to create a suspended disbelief in the viewer. So if the viewer can be transported into a different space just by the thickness of lines, that to me is part of what is interesting and engaging about just black and white and how much room there is to play within that creative space. So now I have this lovely stretch of vertical strips. I start to hatch straight away. There's no forethought, there's no photo reference, there's no influence outside of things which I really enjoy regarding imagery and composition that I've looked at before, but I don't have that to hand now to reference to, or to have guide or sway my marks or directions at all. Instead, I'm just starting, trying to not think too much, and then without any consideration for where this might end up, I just think, what do I want to do next? And not really why or what it means or where it's going to go towards the bottom of the page or on the next panel over. It's just lines and marks that are together creating a flow pattern and then changing how big they are. Now some of this may count as stippling, but I'm not consciously doing dots too much yet. But there probably will be pages where dots are used just as much as hatching and cross-hatching. At the moment, I'm trying to play with the length of the lines that I'm hatching together and drawing. And that's going to have a strange effect once there's enough of them together. It's going to create a new reality, a new sense of environment. And that's because the distance between each of these hatched lines that I'm doing at the moment creates a landscape or an image that just comes to mind. Something which you can read in several different ways, or it may just pop out at you as an obvious, this must be this. And the intention for me is just to spark that interest in the viewer, because I certainly have that interest in these images that I've done before. I do find this really relaxing. I can quite happily sit and hatch for hours and hours. And that's the part which is really fun to me. It's going from really small lines that all follow down on a trail, and then they get longer and wider, or the opposite, where they start off fairly long and then they go more and more short and narrow, as if they're squeezing through a crack in rock face or something like that. It's almost as though it's flowing water that's going down a mountainside. But in truth, I'm just seeing the gaps between the marks and trying to use my intuition to make decisions about what would make me happy about this composition. And what would completely change it. Sometimes I think if I do too many large gaps between it, then you'll have too many white spaces. So I try to stack the lines right next to each other. I know that if you push all of these lines close together, they will create a grey space on the page. And that's really nice because that's a mid-tone. And if you do all the lines really close together in the row that you are hatching, that will be a darker mid-tone. Whereas if you space out the lines just like I'm doing here, it will be a light mid-tone because there's more white getting through in between the black marks. This might not sound interesting to you, but to me this is such an interesting game to play with just a pen and paper or cardboard or whatever you have to hand. Using hatching in different directional lines just as I'm changing the direction of the lines that I'm hatching now to see what happens. What will this mean to the overall image if I start to hatch in these spaces and cover them with different shapes, leaving behind different spaces of white. I have no idea what's going to happen at the end, at this point in the drawing. It's all just play. Now as the camera goes a bit out of focus, it almost showed what it looks like when you squint. And I really recommend squinting at your artwork, whether it's hatching or not. Because when you squint, it shows the light and dark areas consolidated, so pushed together and made into a solid form. That's what squinting does. And I do that when I'm drawing from life or drawing from a reference. I will squint at the reference or from whatever the subject is in life that I'm trying to draw or paint. Because if you squint at it, you can see this area is just darker, and that's what I'm looking for when I squint. What area is darker and what area is catching the light? Now none of this is from a reference, as I said at the beginning. This is all from imagination, and you can do drawings from reference with this technique, and I'll do that in another video. But for this video, this is the freedom of just play with a pen and the idea of keeping the lines uniform and not cross-hatched, just hatching. For this page, it's just an exercise in hatching. Now all of these changes in directional lines, they are having an effect. They are changing what it feels like looking at the image. It's like the flow is crossing over each other. Some things are flowing in one direction and others are going in the opposite direction. And they still look as though they're creating this fluid motion. Because it doesn't look static to me. Maybe that's just me. You'll have to let me know what you see. But to me it does become something where you see movement. And it can be anything. I said water earlier, but it could be clouds, it could be electricity, it could be a mountainside, it could be a hillside, it could be a jacket, it could be, just shadow and light on any surface that has transitions, different angles where the shadow is changing. And part of the freedom of hatching and not cross-hatching is slightly contoured hatching, which just means slightly curved. And I say slightly because I don't want to jar the image too greatly yet. I'll do that in a later page, but at the moment I want to start off slow and easy with just lines upon lines upon lines. What happens when you do that? What does it mean when you push through and create this new reality? Now for this first panel, you can see how I've approached it. I've started from the top left and I've worked my way down to the lower right with each bar. That's the direction of most of the bars. Some of them push upwards, so from the centre left up to the centre right or to the upper right, but not too many. Most of the flow is going in that direction. So that means that in the next page, it would be nice to vary that up. In the next panel. Now each of these vertical strips is a panel. So in the next panel, it would be interesting to change the direction. Just as there you can see it's going from the lower left to higher on the right hand side. To do that with a little bit more, I'm tempted to say freedom, but I suppose all of this is free. It's just that once I've started on a certain direction, my inclination is to follow through with the same movement and patterns. So I suppose to vary that up in the next panel will add interest. To not let one dictate the other too strongly. So the first decisions that I make on this panel shouldn't really affect the next panel until they're all finished. The process of creating each panel should be its own free decision making. The only thing that I'm going to try and do is not follow the same pattern over and over again. Now if I did, it wouldn't hurt, but it would make each of the panels have a different feeling, and it would feel slightly more constrained. I like the idea that I'm not necessarily forced to follow that pattern all the way through each of the panels. But if I were to do that on one page, it would have quite an interesting effect. And it would still be meditative, and it would still be enjoyable and relaxing. But for this panel, I'm immediately starting on the left lower down and working my way upward. At the time it wasn't a conscious choice, but in hindsight I can see that I was trying to break the chain of what I was doing earlier. It was too much repetitive pattern making. So my thought process was the other direction as far as movement from left to right, and the other direction as far as the angle of the hatching. The majority of the hatching on the first panel goes from the upper right to the lower left as far as the direction of the line. So these directions of the line are going from upper left to lower right. It wasn't a conscious choice, but I can see now that that was what was affecting me. Trying to just make a difference. Now even making sparing marks like these and leaving a lot of space in between creates quite an interesting finish. Now the pen started to go a little bit faint there, so that's why I went over some of the lines. I try not to do that too often, but if I lose the ink, then I will try to reinforce the mark. But the amount of white on this second panel is interesting because it means that all of the lines cover the space for a specific finish and effect. And that will look like something again. For the viewer, you may be seeing something quite specific in that second panel. You may be seeing nothing, but for me, it suggests certain things. And I'm not going to say what, I'll let you explore your own imagination for what you're seeing in the second panel. Now for this third panel, you can see immediately I'm going into contoured hatching, curved lines. It's an immediate difference again. And not only that, I'm splitting the lines at the end into two lines. So the thickness of the lines initially are then split into two bars of thin lines. It's all things which to me are investigations. Investigations into the effects and the abilities of drawn marks, hatched lines, rows, and uniformed curves, I suppose, dashes. It's an investigation into the potential of the image which can occur when those are explored. It's an experiment to show what the effect will be and what can be achieved by a commitment to following these directions. It does feel as though as soon as I've made the first mark, that informs the next mark, and I can't see where it's heading. All I can see is that close row and then the distant row that I made next to it, where you can see there's bigger gaps, that affected the second half. Halfway through I started to unify the two. It becomes more interesting. And then making them line up. It's almost as though it's something which moves down and changes direction and becomes thicker and thinner as it pushes across a certain surface. And then filling in some of the areas where I'd missed if I feel like there's potential to add to something. The direction of the lines have changed from one direction to the other, from top left to lower right, now from lower left to upper right, and then as it curves down they change again. Now I found that when I do big arching shapes like this, it looks more organic, it looks like shells or fossils. But that's not what I'm trying to create. I'm just trying to create different shapes and different patterns. I find it more interesting to see what happens at the end than to think about what I'm doing at the time. At the time that I'm doing this, I'm just enjoying the lines and trying to improve upon how clean I can draw the lines. And when you've got a thin nib like this, it's quite tricky to draw clean lines. And these aren't especially clean and neat. And you'll be able to see discrepancies if you look closely. And it's not about being mechanical. It's nice to see the human hand draw, paint, sculpt, create in however you create. And I find that the advent of artificial intelligence into artwork is interesting. It's really interesting, it's intriguing, and I really like some of the different artworks that I've seen be created, but I don't find that too threatening to the human hand, because I don't think it's something where it's replaced what people are doing, and that could change. But if it does, then I'd be surprised if the human hand gets, gets kind of squeezed out of the market. I do feel as though machines creating artwork will have a novelty to it and will become something which people will want to engage with to seem like a modern collector. And then other collectors will see that modern artists from the modern times, are still creating something which would make you of the time as a collector. They're offering things which won't have existed before they've created them. I'm a big believer in creating master studies of works that have been created before, from years ago, could be hundreds of years ago, to improve upon your understanding of how these great artists from the past made these works. And I don't think any master's study is a copy. I think it's an attempt at simulating an aspect of the work, whether it's the tonal values of a masterpiece, or whether it's the line work, or the characterization, or the colours. It can be the composition. There's several different ways of making a master's study, and you're not going to have a photocopy of their work. And if you had a photocopy, that's not a replica. It's not an exact copy. There's always going to be differences. Photocopies can't replicate the colours that were mixed by the original painter. There'll always be differences. So imagine for a moment that you were going to do a master's study of this piece that I'm creating here. That you wanted to replicate this work in order to try to learn something about composition or hatching or any aspect of the work that you appreciated and wanted to learn something from. You wouldn't have the same work that I did. It would be impossible for you to make the same marks that I've made. Whereas what you would have is your own original piece of study. Now, it wouldn't be an original piece of your own creation, of your own thoughts, but you would have created something that is original to the extent that a master's study of this piece has never been made yet. It's an interesting concept to me. But then, I am a fan of master studies, of recreating someone's work, and not with the intention of selling it, but with the intention of learning and growing. And I feel as though my work has improved after doing master studies. I have a video on the channel about master studies if you'd like to see them. I've done several. It's usually pencil drawings. I don't think I've done paintings yet. Now, this different approach, as you can see, is very small marks, and in a different way than the second panel. It just has such a different effect. It looks like it could be something either zoomed out or something completely exploding, or it could be tiny little creatures, or just details and crevices. It could be anything, and that's where I'd like to know what you're seeing out of these different patterns, because it must evoke your brain to create sense out of what you're seeing. Usually we look for faces, and I think I've consciously avoided imposing faces into the marks, but maybe you're seeing faces in certain areas. I'd be impressed if you were, because I'm certainly not making the marks in the arrangement that I would if I were doing a portrait, or if I were creating a face from imagination. Now, the decisions here become a little bit more tricky, because as I come down the page, I usually find that I'm trying to resolve each of the panels in a satisfying way. And by the looks of it, normally what happens is more marks start to accumulate towards the bottom of the panel than at the top. And I think that's because I would feel as though it would be empty feeling if it weren't becoming more busy at the bottom. It would feel imbalanced, but that's probably not true. That might be some subconscious insecurity that I carry, where I think, surely this won't look finished. And if it bothers me, then I'll put more marks in there. But perhaps I should try to be disciplined and not do. Make the centre darker, or make the upper third darker than the lower 2/3. But from the first 3 panels, the weight of the marks go downward. It looks as though gravity has had an effect on the hatching. And even on that fourth panel, there are more long lines of hatching occurring at the bottom of that panel. But that's not a bad thing. I'm not trying to say it's a huge criticism of what I've done. I'm aware that that's something which is having its effect on my decision making. But let's see what happens in this panel. Immediately it's trying to create shapes that I haven't already made. Ones where there are bulges and then it wisps off into a direction. And this row of shapes already is quite interesting to me. They're affected by a direction. If I go in the opposite direction, then that will have a really dramatic effect on what's happening. But if I don't, it will too. I know it sounds as though I've said nothing there, but what I truly mean is that every decision that you make has a profound impact on the finished piece. Now, with these being hatched in the same direction, I do start to have ideas about what it could be. Maybe it's better to not have ideas of what it could be and just to let it be what it is. It is hard to disengage the part of your mind which creates familiar shapes and references, especially when more marks suggest more texture or atmosphere. It's now something which I'm starting to see a snowy mountainside. All the white is the snow, and then the dark parts are bits of rock that you can see through the snow. But that wasn't intentional. And the more uniformity I create, just like the marks on the top left to the centre left, suggests that it isn't, because mountaintops usually don't have that unless it's set up for skiers, because it looks too uniform. I think to make something look organic, it doesn't have too much uniformity. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. Now what happens at the lower parts? The top half is done. Is the lower half going to be very similar? Will it really hurt if it's a whole page, because none of the other pages have that one direction of diagonal lines? It just shows how many different choices you can make. There are so many choices I haven't made yet. There's potentially the option of viewing these images as sequential. That means the first panel then becomes the second panel when viewed from a different angle, or as time passes, what happens in the first panel becomes the second panel, and then that becomes the third, the fourth, and what I'm creating now is the fifth. Again, that's not my intention. That's not the true way of reading it necessarily, but if that's how you read it, then it's true that that's how you read it, and that's completely valid. There is no right and wrong of how to interpret these marks. I'm sure some people will look and see no value in this at all, and other people like myself will see endless potential and value in what I'm doing. It's interesting and engaging. My motivation is that if I were to find a book with pages and pages of these types of lines, I would purchase it. I would really enjoy a book like that. So that's why I'm making my own. And if you have a thought like that, where you think, if someone were to make something like this, I'd like to buy it, then maybe you should make it. I haven't found a book that already exists where someone has done this. I'm sure that they have, but I'm also very confident that I'm not copying them because I don't have any reference. I find it very doubtful that the same thing will occur when 2 people or 10 people or 10,000 or 10 million people do the same thing. We'll all have very, very different marks, different ideas and intuitions about how to compose these panels. Now that 5th panel, I think, is very interesting because of how it subtly varies from every other panel. And this 6th one again is going to have its own rules and its own look. What have I not done in the other 5 vertical lines? There will be vertical lines in the others, but not quite as often as in this 6th panel. So this will make it stand out from the others. And this is one of, I don't know how many other decisions and options there can be until I start to create more pages. And this is the options that are available when doing hatching and not cross-hatching and not so much stippling. But there will be pages of stippling. So this is going to be my project that I'm going to try and add to and create a lot of different interesting textures and ideas. And I know a lot of you out there who viewed my hatching and cross-hatching videos enjoyed that, so I'm hoping that you get as much out of this as I do, because I made pages like these before and they're called texture pages. They will be included in the book that I eventually hope to make, and for now it's just a mission of how would I start this book, because I don't think that the first few pages that I made would be the start of the book. I feel as though I'm starting from fresh with this page. This is how I want it to start off. Just hatching. Where does hatching take you? What can you say with just these ideas? Now you have to excuse any background noise that happens. I'm trying to be as quiet as I can be, but there will be some background noise from time to time. Now you see how I'm creating a larger gap between these lines and then doing another row of lines with large gaps in between them. This is again a conscious decision which I made in the moment, and then making smaller lines with slightly smaller gaps and small lines with even tighter spaces between them again, because I know that that will transition to a gradient of tone. And you can see it in that bar that I just drew. The marks start off with gaps and then they get tighter and tighter. But they will all stay vertical. All the lines will remain vertical. That's something which I haven't done on any of the pages, is horizontal lines. They've either been diagonal or contoured, and in this case vertical. So on the next page perhaps I will move on to horizontal and explore more contoured lines in different ways and see what occurs. But for the time being, I think it's not only the direction of the lines but the distance between them, the distance between each line and the distance between each row of lines. It becomes a thickness, a density. It starts to look structural to me. But potentially it could be a bird's eye view on a landscape. or anything. It could be layers of sedimentary rock where you have a section of the landscape just cut like a slice of a cake, just to look at the different layers of soil, stone and rock, minerals and things which occur in the depth of the landscape. Could be something completely different. It could be a wall, or again, it could be a million things. All I'm saying is that because it is so uniformed of being vertical lines, what does that look like to you? Or does it look like anything? Because to me it's very interesting having that imposition. You will not be on an angle. You will not be curved. This panel is only vertical. And what happens as it goes thicker at the bottom? Which again, it seems to be consistent throughout this page. The weight goes downward. You have to excuse the wobble of the camera. The camera is not on the table, but it's mounted onto something which is leaning against the table, and I think that's what caused it to wobble a bit. But there we are. That is the page. That is the first page of a texture book that I am hoping to create, of hatching, cross-hatching and stippling. Try it for yourself, especially if you have different thickness nibs, because on this page I've only used one thickness of a nib, which is 0.1, and that's a nice thin nib, but it does mean that it takes longer to cover that distance than it would with a thicker nib. But I recommend trying it, maybe not in panels like this, but just try it as far as make a box and then cover the box and see what happens, see what it looks like. Maybe try to make it look like something. But either way, just have fun. Okay, there we are. Aside from a couple of marks which I made which kind of went a bit thin, I thought that was quite an interesting page. So there is texture page number 1. And I did used to make these quite often, and I do quite like making things like this, so I'll start to develop more and more of these next time, maybe with some cross-hatching, maybe with a different pen next time, but I just think that it's got potential, you know, something about it which is, yeah, it's quite interesting looking at it through the camera, because when you're drawing things like this, you don't really notice where what it actually looks like. It's more, you're so closely focused on each mark and how they relate to the next that you don't really notice what's working and what isn't. But there we are. I thought that was quite fun. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then please leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell, and I will see you in the next video.